Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Africa is in problem, in a serious mess. We seem to be going from one crisis to the other. Started with slavery. When that finally ended, we became colonial properties for other people. And with the independence of South Africa in 1994, we thought we'd put that one behind us. But if anything at all, in fact, for most African countries, they now look back to the time of independence, of colonial rule, as the golden age. Because independent Africa, most of the countries, independent African countries, have become failed states, and Zimbabwe being one of them. And we've had one crisis after another. Poverty, civil war, all manner of strife. Africa has got probably the greatest abundance of natural resources. And yet, it is the poorest continent on earth. I think it is true that when we removed the colonial West, we didn't become immediately colonized by the East, particularly Russia and China, but they've been more subtle than that. They have taken over Africa in more subtle ways. They have maintained the black majority rule only as a puppet for their own ends. Russia and China helped to fight to end white colonialism, but clearly their agenda was not to ensure that Africans are free and enjoy the same freedoms as everybody else. I think they helped Africa fight to end white colonial rule, Western colonial rule, for the purpose of taking over. And those two nations have taken over Africa. The influence of China and Russia in Africa is undeniable. And right now, Russia has played a really prominent role in keeping Africa in the mess we are in. Listen to this cartoon.
A private military contractor controlled by the Kremlin has been using these brutal tactics in Central Africa. They have over 50,000 contractors and offer their services to ruthless authoritarian leaders, along with being responsible for numerous human rights violations and destabilizing governments. The incredible thing is that their tactics might be working. Russia is gaining more and more influence on the continent, and in the future, many African countries could come under the direct control of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. In order to understand how Russia is using the Wagner Group to control several countries in Africa, we must first examine who this band of mercenaries are and their ties to the Russian government. They're fueled by three things: money, resources, and power. In order to secure these objectives in Africa, the Wagner Group operates by always keeping Russian interests in mind. The organization itself has been working in Africa since at least 2017, but Russia's been exploiting certain African countries long before that. It was the Wagner Group's combat operations, security forces for hire, disinformation campaigns, gray zone tactics, and manipulation of the United Nations that have allowed its mercenary group to gain so much power and a strong footing on the African continent. Make no mistake, everything the Wagner Group is doing is either ordered by Putin and his close advisors or beneficial to the Russian government in some way. Unfortunately, what Russia normally wants comes at the expense of the African people. The Wagner Group was formed by a Russian oligarch named Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is also known as Putin's chef. He got this name from the constant visits that the Russian president makes to his restaurants. These dinners are likely just a front for Prigozhin and Putin to discuss business behind closed doors. Currently, Yevgeny Prigozhin is sanctioned by the United States and most European governments, just like Vladimir Putin and the rest of his officials. The Wagner Group first appeared in 2014 during Russia's invasion of Crimea. It was here that reports of little green men accompanying the Russian military were seen torturing and killing Ukrainian citizens who opposed the annexation of their homeland. After the world allowed Russia to annex Crimea without any real consequences, the Wagner Group began to expand its operations to the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Since the Wagner Group was formed in 2014, the organization has grown immensely, thanks largely to the massive amount of support it receives from the Russian government. Even though the Kremlin denies any involvement with the Wagner Group, Russian leadership doesn't try especially hard to hide the actual truth. The organization has grown tremendously thanks to direct involvement of the Kremlin and having the Russian military's weapons, bases, and vehicles at their disposal. In recent years, it's been estimated that around 5,000 Wagner Group mercenaries have deployed to countries across Central Africa. The men sent to this region of the world by the Wagner Group are made up of former Russian soldiers, foreign nationals, and even convicts who have been hired for their deadly skills and unquestioning obedience in return for freedom and money. In January of 2023, the United States officially designated the Wagner Group as a transnational criminal organization. Before discussing the tactics that the Wagner Group uses and the services they provide that shift the balance of power in Africa, let's examine where Russia has sent this secret militia force that they claim to know nothing about and that supposedly does not exist. Currently, the Wagner Group is conducting most of its operations in the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, and Sudan. However, their presence can also be found in Madagascar, Kenya, South Africa, Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zimbabwe. In general, the Wagner Group is targeting nations that have rocky relationships with the West due to centuries of colonization and oppression. The Wagner Group also operates in countries with authoritarian rulers or governments that are in tumultuous situations. It's in these countries that the Wagner Group offers its services in exchange for concessions that benefit Russia. The Wagner Group has provided security services to some of the most brutal dictators and regimes in Central Africa, along with military training for their forces and disinformation campaigns to get the general public on their side. However, the Wagner Group will also act as an extension of the Russian military when need be. In 2019, leaked British intelligence documents showed that the Wagner Group had identified several countries that it would target for future operations in Africa. Most had autocratic governments that were losing power. What this shows is that the organization has plans to expand its influence in Africa even as Russia continues to lose the war in Ukraine. We'll come back to why this might be later, but it's important to note that wherever the Wagner Group is sent, pain and death will follow. The stability of Central Africa may be in jeopardy if Russia does not stop meddling in its affairs. Now let's look at what the Wagner Group is doing in these countries and how it's able to dominate the regions around Central Africa. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the Wagner Group's success is due to brutal tactics such as massacring entire villages, torturing anyone who stands against them, and leaving a wake of destruction wherever they go. Since the Wagner Group is technically a band of mercenaries for hire, the services they provide in each country vary based on the needs of the client that hires them. But it's not just authoritarian governments who are looking to secure the Wagner Group's services. They also work with rebel groups and terrorist organizations. Basically, as long as they get paid or the deal furthers Russian interests in the area, the mercenaries will lend their services to anyone who asks. The jobs they perform can vary, but pretty much everything the Wagner Group does in Africa can be categorized into 5 different subgroups. Number 1. Combat and military operations. The Wagner Group has provided mercenaries to both governments who are fighting rebel groups and rebel groups who are trying to overthrow governments in Africa. It's estimated that around 1,000 mercenaries were sent to the Central African Republic in 2018 to help defend President Faustin Archange Touadéra's government against rebel attacks in the capital of Bangui. Touadera has been trying to change the country's constitution to allow him to remain in power indefinitely, which would dismantle the democratic election process that was in place and formally turn it into an authoritarian government. This was one of the reasons why the Wagner Group was willing to offer Touadera assistance in suppressing any dissent or uprisings. In return, Touadera's government offered the Wagner Group, its subsidiaries, and by extension the Russian government, unrestricted logging rights in his country and control over the Indasima gold mine, which is estimated to hold around 500 tons of gold, or the equivalent of around 2.7 billion US dollars, or 2.5 billion euros. In return for limitless logging rights and a massive amount of gold, the Wagner Group has agreed to help President Faustin Archange Touadera stay in power by decimating any rebel groups or organizations that may threaten his rule. They've strengthened the current government's military exponentially, ensuring that no one can stand up to them. The deal has also forged closer ties between the Central African Republic government and the Kremlin. Mozambique sought out similar services from the Wagner Group in 2019. A group of rebels claimed the northern Cabo Delgado province was under the control of the Islamic State. This was a huge problem for the Mozambique government. The Wagner Group was hired to infiltrate the area and take out the rebels. However, just because the mercenaries are willing to do pretty much anything for money doesn't mean they're always effective. As fighting intensified, the Wagner Group realized they were in over their heads and decided to withdraw from the conflict. However, the organization still managed to further Russian interests and commit human rights violations while they were in the country. In Libya, the Wagner Group sent around 1,200 mercenaries to fight alongside Khalifa Hifter, a man who many have called Libya's most potent warlord. He's used his military leadership to oppose the Libyan government for years and has tried to claim control over the country through force several times. Hifter hired the Wagner Group to help him reach those goals, but without much success. The key here was that Hifter could pay, which was more than enough reason for the mercenaries to join in his failed conquest. In Mali, the Wagner Group has been accused of carrying out heinous crimes to help the anti-Western military junta gain power. Ever since the coup d'etat in 2020 and 2021, the transition of power has been tumultuous. The Russian-backed military leaders vying for power have encountered opposition, and the Wagner Group has helped further their cause in some brutal ways. In 2022, the Wagner Group executed 300 people in the rural town of Mura. Human Rights Watch concluded that although some of these people were soldiers, most were civilians, making the slaughter of the entire village one of the worst massacres the country had ever seen. The bodies were then buried near the Gossi military base, where French forces were getting ready to pull out of the region. Russia started a social media campaign that stated it was French soldiers who killed innocent civilians and put them in hastily dug graves. However, as the French were withdrawing, they conducted aerial surveillance that showed the Russian soldiers digging the graves and dumping bodies into them. So the Wagner Group was not just fighting to install a pro-Russian government in Mali, but also massacring civilians at the same time. However, human rights violations and combat support are not the only services the Wagner Group provides in Africa. They also offer other assistance to mold authoritarian regimes into governments that Russia can exploit. Number 2. Security and training. New authoritarian rulers or regimes that are growing often require security services and training to ensure they're not overthrown by other entities. The Wagner Group provides this support in exchange for money and resources. For example, in the Central African Republic, the Wagner Group served as President Faustin Archange Touadera's personal bodyguards while also training his army to suppress and combat a possible coup against his leadership. There are an estimated 1,890 Russian instructors that have provided training for government troops since the Wagner Group was hired. The Russian and Central African Republic governments are working closely to solidify the authoritarian rule of President Faustin Archange Touadera. The Wagner mercenaries drive around in unmarked vehicles to gather intel and forcibly stop any dissent they come across. The Wagner Group also conducts security for the nation's gold and diamond mines, which they almost certainly get a kickback from. Valery Zakharov is a Russian national and President Touadera's national security advisor. He's also a key figure in the Wagner Group's command structure. This allows the organization to influence military decisions made by the Central African government and promote contracts that are beneficial for Russia and the Wagner Group. Both Putin and the Wagner Group leaders are exploiting the resources and the government of the CAR through the training and security services that they provide the Central African Republic. The Wagner Group has also been training troops in the Sudan military since 2017. They also guarded the country's mineral resources and made sure that President Omar al-Bashir was protected since the Kremlin already had close ties to his regime. While Omar al-Bashir was in power, Russia enjoyed access to the country's gold mines as long as they kept them protected. However, even when al-Bashir was removed from power, Russia used the Wagner Group to maintain control over key interests in the country. In February of 2022, while Russia was launching its initial invasion of Ukraine, Wagner Group members were loading a plane full of cookies in Sudan. The aircraft took off and landed along the coast of Syria, where it was inspected. The cargo manifest seemed odd to airport officials since the only thing listed was crates full of cookies. Upon inspection, the officials found a massive amount of gold lying just underneath the top layer of cookies. Before the plane could be seized, Russian military personnel stepped in and forcibly told officials there was nothing on the plane but cookies, so the Wagner Group members could continue on their way unimpeded. $2.85 billion in gold is exported from Sudan every year. Around 80% of that is believed to be smuggled out of the country rather than through traditional means. The Wagner Group takes advantage of the current status quo by offering security services for mines and stealing the gold for shipment back to Russia. However, Moscow also has ownership stakes in several mines in the country as well, meaning that a huge amount of gold is funneled out of the country through back channels that the Wagner Group provides to avoid paying the Sudan government. In order to ensure that business can continue as usual, the Wagner Group has continued to support and train the Sudanese military. Number 3. Disinformation campaigns. Another way that Russia has been able to maintain dominance in many African countries is by using the Wagner Group to conduct disinformation campaigns. It's been reported that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner Group, also owns the Internet Research Agency. This is a troll farm that floods websites, news outlets, and social media with information that furthers the Russian agenda. The Internet Research Agency worked with individuals in Ghana and Nigeria to feed the growing division in the United States during the 2016 presidential elections.
Well, we can stop there. Russia is already in Zimbabwe. It is active in the Marange and Chiadzwa mine diamonds, and has also acquired a lot of platinum mine title deeds or mining concessions. We can't rule out, although of course there's no point in asking the Zimbabwe government that, they will deny it. We can't rule out that the Russians are helping Mnangagwa stay in power, be it with helping him with financially, or supplying him with information that will help him to rig the elections, and other activities such as training the CIO and so forth. China is also heavily involved with that. But the point here is, now that China and Russia have got their foot in Zimbabwe, and Mnangagwa is desperate to hang on to power, these two nations are not going to leave Zimbabwe alone. As much as we would want to fight to end the ZANU-PF dictatorship so that we can finally have free, fair, and credible election, restore all the human freedoms and basic human rights, I don't think this is going to happen. These two nations are in Zimbabwe and they are there to stay. And they are determined to stay. And they've got a regime that is so desperate to hang on to power, they would rather burn down the whole house than let anybody else rule Zimbabwe. So that is the tragedy we in Zimbabwe are facing and have got to deal with. ZANU-PF is not going away in a hurry. And in its desperation, it has now engaged the services of Russia and China. We are we're in the middle of an election, and we are fighting that these elections should be free, fair, and credible. Of course, Russia doesn't want the elections to be free, fair, and credible. And we will be very happy to see ZANU-PF rig the elections and stay in power. and it will do anything to help them rig those elections and stay in power. As a nation, we are not going to move. As long as we remain a nation that is always being manipulated by others for their own selfish ends. We had the golden opportunity in 2008 to 2013 to implement the democratic reforms which would have ended ZANU-PF dictatorship. Alas, not even one meaningful reform was implemented in that period, and we are paying dearly for it. The longer this present situation continues, the harder it's going to be to end the ZANU-PF dictatorship. That is a fact. That is a fact we cannot deny. We really need to start looking into this problem of bad governance with the seriousness and agency the matter demands. Participating in the ongoing elections will only serve to give the process itself credibility, and therefore then give the vote rigging ZANU-PF legitimacy. Once ZANU-PF has got the legitimacy, they can do as they please. We saw that in 2018. They gave the instructions to the soldiers to shoot to kill. All those who went on the street to protest against the flawed electoral process. Once you have participated, you have per se accepted the system. And to try to remove the regime by street protests is plain foolish. People should wake up to that reality. That is not going to happen. The best thing we can do now is to refuse to participate in these elections and make sure that our protestations are heard. Yes, it is too late to get reforms implemented, but it is not too late to remind, particularly our friends in SADC, that these elections are flawed. And to remind our friends in SADC that our opposition parties, Triple C and the rest of the teams in the opposition, are participating in these elections out of greed. They know that the process is flawed. They know that ZANU-PF is rigging these elections. They know that by participating, they're actually giving ZANU-PF legitimacy. But they still participate because they also know that ZANU-PF is offering a few seats on the gravy train. And that they find irresistible. And Mnangagwa in 2018 went one step further and created this monster called Pollard, which is basically a grouping of all those who participated in the presidential elections and lost, but were willing to publicly endorse the electoral process as free, fair, and credible, and Mnangagwa as legitimately elected president. And so these politicians, these opportunists, these sellouts in the opposition are participating in these 2023 elections for the same reason, out of greed. It is nauseating arguments one has often heard from some of the Triple C supporters in saying, oh no, Triple C has to participate because even if they withdraw, the rest of the other opposition parties will participate and get their gravy train seats. The most important thing to understand there is they're participating for the sake of the gravy train seats, out of greed. There is no principal reason why anyone would participate in an election process that is so flawed that the only thing you're doing there is giving the vote rigging party legitimacy. But if you don't have principle, you're willing to go for the price that is on offer, then of course you participate. But let's not make the mistake of pretending that Triple C are somehow doing the ordinary Zimbabwean a favor by participating. They're doing it out of greed, period. They themselves cannot resist the bribe that is on offer. Just as much as Monzora cannot resist participating to get that prize too. We can't be locked into this meaningless election process just because the opposition are greedy. All of them, they're participating out of greed. And I think it is up to the ordinary Zimbabweans to realize that the opposition are participating in these elections out of greed and stop supporting them. If the ordinary people themselves see the futility of participating in these elections, then they would also see the futility of attending these opposition rallies. Why would you want to attend a rally of somebody who is participating to sell you out? This is a mountain to climb for most of our ordinary Zimbabweans whose understanding of politics is at best superficial. But so be it. This is where we are. The challenge of ending the present political and economic crisis in Zimbabwe is getting tougher and tougher by the day. If ZANU-PF wins the elections on the 23rd of August and they have another 5 years in power, trust me, at the end of it, it will be even tougher to remove ZANU-PF from office. The other day, I was dealing with the problem of how ANC in South Africa is hell-bent on making sure that ZANU-PF remains in power for their own selfish reasons. This is the reality. We have failed to run our own affairs. And now outsiders, for their own selfish reasons, are interfering and are taking full advantage of the situation. The Russians are in Zimbabwe because they realize Mnangagwa is desperate to stay in power and he will do anything to stay in power. And they are exploiting that to the full. The Chinese are in Zimbabwe. And they too realize that Mnangagwa is desperate to hang on to power and he'll do anything to hang on to power. And they've offered him a lot of help in return for looting the country. Now they've got a foothold in Zimbabwe. They are not going to give up the wealth they are getting from Zimbabwe. They are going to continue. And so we are faced with a situation here where these nations are not fighting on the side of freedom, justice, and human dignity. They are fighting on the side of the tyrannical ZANU-PF regime. This is the reality that we are going to deal with. This fight to end the political crisis in Zimbabwe, to end this case of rigged elections and bad governance that has made Zimbabwe a failed state, is not going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be a tough one. And if we're going to win it, we need to be really smart. At the present moment, I honestly don't see how anyone can continue participating in these elections, knowing that this election is flawed, knowing that this election is, by participating, they're only giving ZANU-PF legitimacy. But that voice has got to be heard and heard loud. It's not too late. We can still do it. But if we don't, if we participate, then the world is saying, well, Zimbabweans are not yet ready for a democracy, a functioning, healthy and functioning democracy. And will leave us to stew. And the longer ZANU-PF stays in power, the harder it's going to be to remove this regime. That's one thing that is clearly obvious now. We are just going round and round in circles here. We need to make progress. We need to end this ZANU-PF dictatorship. And we are not going to end it by participating in flawed elections to give the regime legitimacy. That is the number one message I wanted to leave with you tonight. Thank you very much and good night.